Hi everyone! Today I have the huge pleasure, along with Elizabeth Rovere, who is a clinical psychologist and the executive producer of our documentary, to interview Dr. Joe Loizzo. He is the founder and director of the Nalanda Institute for Contemplative Sciences, and he's going to share his vast experience on the more esoteric teachings of Buddhism about the heart. To me, it's another great puzzle piece that shows and hints at why and how the heart is at the center of a looming cross-cultural, scientific and spiritual revolution, and why the heart might be the key to the paradise we all long for.
The tradition that was preserved in Nalanda University and then preserved again in Tibet after the starting from the 8th to the 12th century is, a version of the Buddhist teaching tradition, which preserves the kind of the scientific, university-based, the most rigorous curriculum that Buddhism developed. So just to take a step back and look at the Buddha himself, in the Buddha's day, he was living in a period some called the period of the shamanic revolution, a revolution in Indian society where the esoteric traditions held mainly by the elite classes, the Brahmin and the ruling classes, were increasingly interfacing with indigenous traditions and being popularized. So it's a time when the spirit of the time was every person has a right to achieve moksha or liberation. But in order to do so in the Indian tradition, they had to have the methods. They had to have the wisdom and they had to have the methods to understand how to move from the ordinary personality that's sort of embedded in a coarse body and mind to the essence of, if you want, the soul or the essence of the living being. And the Upanishadic teachings, right, the ancient, the sort of latest version of the Vedic tradition that's part of Orthodox Hinduism, had a sort of very subtle and interesting relationship and sort of science of understanding what was the essence of the being and of the human being or the human spirit, and basically the understanding in both the sort of spiritual tradition or the wisdom tradition and the yoga tradition was that mind or spirit is interconnected with matter, right? So it was a sort of more of an embodied approach to spirit than we might have. We're used to in the West, either the classical West or the certainly the modern West, where we separate mind and body as two completely separate things. And so as part of that, you'll find in the yoga tradition the notion of the subtle body, that is this kind of embodied map of the nervous system, not as we know it today, from the outside in as a coarse anatomical structure, but as it's experienced from the inside out within a living being. Right? Where do we feel our nervous system? How can we feel our nervous system? And that's a way to think about what the subtle body is, that it's kind of a first person, what I call interoceptive map, right? That is a map about our felt experience of being aware inside a living body, inside a nervous system. And within the Upanishads, there's a teaching that the essence of the human being is in a sort of what's called an indestructible drop, an akshara bindu in Sanskrit, which is located within the heart chakra, right? So this goes way back, right? And the Buddha, when he went to take the Indian yogic meditative science out of the sort of class structure or the sort of elite culture and caste structure of Indian spiritual education, he went to popularize it and make this accessible to everybody. So that's the whole idea. And as you can think of Buddhist science or the Buddhist tradition as sort of like, the popular science of spirituality, or a scientific approach to spirituality, right? There's less of a focus on mythology or creation or God, and there's really a focus on causality. With the Buddha's great discovery, that it's sort of a almost naturalistic scientific approach to the mind and to life. And as part of that, there's this embodied understanding from the very beginning that mind isn't in the brain, or isn't stuck in the brain the way we think of it as, but that mind is distributed throughout the whole mind and body, and specifically located within the subtle body, that is the sort of first person or internally experienced map of the nervous system. And so there's, from the very early times in the Buddhist systematizing, what is the nature of mind, and how can we learn to change the way it works from the way in which it's all tied up in knots and bound within conditioning and instincts that are based on survival, that are based on eons, what's called beginningless evolution, right? So way back, right? The way we evolved to survive was seen as a sort of heap of conditioning that was like imprisoned the spirit within a survival mechanism, or a kind of a compulsive survival system or network. And so he taught, how do we get to the essence of the mind and the spirit that he believed was naturally pure, right? That he believed that all of this conditioning that layered over or entangled or enmeshed the mind and spirit and heart within the human body was actually not our essential original nature, that our original nature was a luminous, brilliant, blissful, open, ecstatic mind, right? A mind like a spiritual, like that was his view. And and very early in the teachings, therefore, when he set up Buddhist psychology, he set it up so that the mind is really understood as located in the heart, right? And in fact, in Buddhist tradition, the what's up here is said to be the body. So there are three basic elements. Like we have a Trinity in the West, right? We have the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, and and in the Buddhism, the way these are understood is body, speech, and mind. So mind is like the Father, the Godhead. Body is the incarnation, right? And speech is the spirit, or the speech and breath are seen as two sides of the same coin, right? And the way they're located in Buddhist psychology is, it said that body is up here, which is really kind of a recognition of the fact that this is where our ordinary sense of our bodies is highly constructed, imagined, complicated physical thing. Spirit or speech is in the throat, and the mind is in the heart, right? So this whole sort of, very, very different approach to embodied consciousness, or what mind and consciousness are, was embedded eventually in the Buddhist tradition, became, because the Buddha spent his lifetime trying to make spiritual education accessible to everybody. When Indian civilization was ready to start founding universities, like mainstream institutions to teach people how to live well, and all the sciences and arts that we think of that developed in our own universities 1,000 or 2,000 years later, they turned to the Buddhists to create those universities. And Nalanda and others, there was a handful of early universities that started really in the early centuries, like around the time of, not Christ, but the apostles, and around 150 or 200 in the Common Era. And basically these were, the curriculum was Buddhist, but it was also involving Hindu teachings and yoga teachings and and there were secular arts and sciences like medicine, engineering, architecture, political science or political theory. And you didn't have to be a monk or a nun to enter. So these were real universities. Nalanda University was founded in North India, very near where the Buddha used to live. In fact, he used to teach. He loved to teach in this particular kind of a suburb or sort of a beautiful kind of retreat. And essentially when this was founded, this became eventually a very large, like a university, which is said to have had in the 6th or 7th century enrollments of 10 to 15,000. So it became a huge, like a modern university, and this was in the 6th century. Like our first universities in the West didn't really start until the 12th century in Naples, and then Bologna, and then Paris and Oxford. So this was like 1,000 years before, and the size was huge, right, for that time. And Nalanda wasn't the only one. There were at the time a handful. There was Odantipuri, Vikramashila, Danyakataka, Takshashila. There were a number of other universities that had their special focus. So the wonderful thing about that system is that you had this critical mass and people from all around Asia. There were colleges at Nalanda from Japan, China, Korea, Indonesia, Thailand, Vietnam, Tibet, Afghanistan. So this was an international. It was like Harvard, of Asia, and really focused and very critically on refining this understanding of the mind and body, and how do you, in some sense, for medical purposes. Well, that was part of it. Medicine was really refined there. But most importantly, for the sort of the art of living, how do you learn to live well in a human mind and body? How do you understand how to work with, the instincts, the destructive instincts of stress and self-protection, and the delusion that keeps us from understanding our full potential, if you will, our full capacity. And sort of as a special final development of that tradition, integrating both the medical understanding and the yogic understanding, they developed a system or a series of esoteric systems of exploring consciousness called tantras. Okay, so you can think of Buddhism as having three, like we have Old Testament, New Testament, and mysticism, right? And similarly, there's a periodization in Indian spirituality. So you have early Buddhism and yoga, right, and the early Upanishadic traditions. Then you have classical Hinduism, like the Gita and Mahabharata and so on. And alongside that, you have classical, what's called Mahayana Buddhism. That's the Buddhism that's about the whole society transforming into a loving society. Basically, it's a social approach to spirituality. It's like the New Testament, right? Love and compassion, community, all of that. And then eventually around the 6th century, you start to have this esoteric form. So like we didn't get the proliferation of mysticism. Well, it was starting in the Neoplatonics, right? But it was, really didn't go big time until, the 12th century or the 13th, 14th century. In India, that period was, again, earlier, from the 6th to the 12th century or 10th century, was the flowering of this esoteric, mystical approach. But in the Buddhist understanding, it wasn't mystical. In the Buddhist understanding, this was just science. This was just the sort of a sophisticated way of understanding our full potential. And how do you quickly, the essence of the tantras are, how do you embody enlightenment? How do you understand, how do you feel it and live it in your whole body? How do you transform the ordinary survival-based kind of prison of a body, where we're trapped in our instincts and our reactivities and our misperceptions, our intense subjectivity? How do you transform that into a luminous, blissful, kind of mammalian, much more mammalian, socially open and interconnected nervous system and awareness? And so the tantras The compassion tradition paved the way and said, we need to do this. We need to learn how to embody love and compassion. But the tantras are really the esoteric science of how do we do that using yoga and the yogic methodologies of transforming the nervous system. So that sort of gets us to, how the heart was viewed within that, the tantric or esoteric neuropsychology, and that's a psychology that was shared between the medical system, the yogic tradition, and the spiritual tradition.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's a great context and overview of where we're going into now. Elizabeth, do you have something to go in here? A question of yours?
Well, it's definitely a going into in the tantric tradition, in the Vajrayana or Tibetan Buddhism, and in your book Sustainable Happiness, you talk a little bit about like this indestructible drop of the subtle energy mind. And then in another way you said bliss void drop of subtlest energy chemistry mind. And then I was like, okay, well, that's a lot of words to describe something that probably is really difficult to understand. So I was wondering, like, is there actually a word that we don't have a translation for? Or like, how do we understand what this actually means?
Okay, so I think the best way for us as modern scientifically educated Westerners to approach this is to recognize that the map of the subtle body, which is where this language is coming from, was also shared with the medical tradition, and is a map of the nervous system, right? So within that, like in our system, we have, what are the elements of the nervous system? We have, nuclei or centers, circuits, neural circuits. We have pathways that are neural pathways. We have energies that run the neurons, and we have drops, which are chemistry, which is the neurotransmitters that get secreted, that send the messages. So essentially, within the subtle body map, you have all those similar analogous elements. You've got what are called channels, which are the pathways. You've got the chakras or the circuits, which are the circuits and the kind of centers, or you can call them ganglia, but they're really, best to think of them as circuits or centers. And then you have the winds, what are called the winds, or the energies that are the equivalent of our neural energies that travel through the pathways. And then you have the drops that are the equivalent of our neurochemicals, at least in terms of explanatory models, right? This is what they're trying to model, how the nervous system works, and they recognize that there's some element that's kind of has a kind of liquid phasic, character. So the way that system is described is extremely beautiful, right? And that is that it's like three nested layers, like the Russian dolls, So the outer part is what's called the coarse mind and body, and that's the waking state mind, and it's supported by in the senses, our sense of a physical body. It's supported by channels that sprout off of the central channel. So the central channel is like the neuraxis, what we call the neuraxis. That is the spinal cord going up to the brain and ending around here somewhere. And coming off of that, there's a series of smaller and smaller channels, sort of like sort of like arteries, smaller arterioles and capillaries, right? So the coarse mind and body is supported by all these peripheral channels, right? So it's like a whole web of peripheral channels that are touching everything, and making the senses work, and those things do the things that are normal, that our nervous system is said to do. They control breathing, they control digestion, they control excretion and reproduction, speech, they and the senses. right? Now, within that, the next Russian doll in the nest is called a subtle-minded body. And that's what's mapped by what we think of as the yogic nervous system. The 3 central channels with the 6 or 5, 6, or however many chakras, depending on the system. And then each of those have like a couple of, maybe somewhere between, 6 to 32 different, larger branches that create a circuit. So the chakras are made of pathways that branch off of the central channel and then create a little circuit. So within that sort of what we think of as the central nervous system is where we have our internal experience of mind state, emotion, conceptuality, symbolic processing. That's like our inner experience of having a mind and knowing we're in a body, right? Now, at the heart of it all, and this is usually located at the extremely subtle drop in the heart, right? So within the central channel, there are drops, and some of them are kind of, they're thought of as originating from or sourced from different chakras. So there are drops that travel throughout the whole nervous system, but the mother drop is thought to be at the heart of the central channel, at the heart. That's kind of like the ultimate source of all the chemicals that run the nervous system. And that has a word called the akshara bindu. A bindu is a Sanskrit word for drop, but bindu also means, it also has other subtle meanings. The thing that they put on the third eye is called a bindu. Bindu also in some contexts means 0. Like it's thought of as the quintessential, the subtlest, point of reality, a fabric of the sort of atom of reality, or subtle, building block of reality. So bindu has a number of different meanings, and akshara means it can't be broken. It's never destroyed. So this is kind of, if you wanted to look for a place where the soul lives, in their view, the more abiding or enduring or continuous part of ourselves is supported by that indestructible drop at the heart. Now, it also is intimately connected with other drops at the other chakras, right? That are source sort of local variations coming off of this. But, that's the essence. And so, their view is that, let's say, this whole system was formed by eons of evolution, based where survival was the main imperative, and extreme reactions attack. So there's misperception at the heart of it all. I perceive myself as solitary, unrelated to the world and others around me, even though it's not true, right? But I'm treating myself as if I'm the only living thing in the world, or the only thing that matters, or the center of the universe. And as a result of that, I feel very alienated from the world, and I therefore end up stressing out a lot and getting very clingy when I'm frightened or desirous, or getting very averse when I'm threatened or frustrated. So those two forces are sort of the fundamental force of delusion and the two other forces of clinging and aversion are sort of thought of as instantiated or based in the operation of the 3 central channels, right? So delusion is sort of based in, do we have access to the inside the central channel where the real smart mind lives, right? The real mind that knows our nature lives inside the central channel. It's blissful, it's luminous, it's open, it's infinite, it's all pervading, but it's hidden in there, protected. Then the 2 side channels are like the fight-flight system, which is the clingy, fear-based system, like what I would call the sympathetic nervous system, and the aversion system is like the parasympathetic faint freeze system, right? So essentially, the idea is that because we spend our lives in confusion, and bouncing back and forth between clinging and aversion, we get all knotted up inside. It's like we're all a kind of tangled knot. And this is really literally depicted as the side channels knotting around the central channel at each of the chakras. So this is traditionally, it's sort of like they do a twist, sort of like, you've ever seen a little twist ring, like a snake ring or something like that. So like the central channel would be your finger, and then the side channels would twist around it. And so that happens at the forehead, it happens at the crown, it happens at the throat, it happens at the heart, the navel, and the sacrum or pelvis. And when it knots around the central channel, it cuts off our ability to access the central channel consciously. The only way we can access the central channel is by falling into sleep and unconsciousness. And then the central channel is sort of operating, but dissociated from our normal waking consciousness, which is more like living in the extremes, is more dualistic. So the idea is that in the whole process of healing or yoga or transformation mapped in this way is like the Holy Grail. We're trying to get from this. We're all removed, or like the Odyssey. We're all removed from the source of our being, caught up in all this waves of extreme confusion and reactivity. How can we calm all of that and then take this journey to the center of to the core of our being? In which case we'll sort of recover the kind of whatever the Garden of Eden or the original blissful communion with reality and the full power of our awareness. And then we can remake the nervous system in an open, pliable, luminous way that's not based on fear and reactivity, but it's based on blissful wisdom or intuitive awareness or intuitive openness, and joy, compassion, equanimity, all the sort of those good social emotions. So that's kind of the idea, is that we're trying to kind of rewire our nervous system, and the indestructible drop is like the philosopher's stone or the alchemical elixir, that if we can get it, we can transform the whole raw material of our bodies into this, luminous, blissful, embodiment.
This is so cool. I love this, the way you describe it now. I mean, your book is very academic and is very scientific. So sometimes with the way you describe it here, I'm like, oh, now I get it. Okay, now I get it. I find this super fascinating. In this case, if you don't have anything right now, Elizabeth, I would love to have a little bit more clarification on the emotion, because in my daily life, I would say, okay, I have a clear experience of my body, physicality, and of thinking, thoughts, and then of emotions as like the three aspects of my daily life. And so I would be very curious, because you already mentioned that the mind was thought to be in the heart, which is like completely opposite of how we view the mind in the Western world and in the modern science, where it's like in the brain. Or now I read an article, okay, now it's not in the brain, but it's still somehow here, rather here than here. So I would be curious as what's the connection in these teachings of the mind? What is the definition for mind? How does it relate to thinking and emotions?
Yeah. So there are there's the three nested nervous system, and each of the nervous levels of the nervous system supports a different state of consciousness, right? So the coarse one supports the waking state, which is about coarse sense perception and imagination and things like that. The subtle supports the dream state and this more emotionally charged, expressive and fluid quality of awareness. And then the deep sleep state, which is also akin to or connected with the orgasm state, supports the extremely subtle mind and body. And that's a kind of quality of consciousness which is considered to be non-dual, where there's no experience of being the subject being separate from the object. So it's like the ability of consciousness to merge with what it knows or what it experiences. So in that, you'd say, in a way, thought, or at least the kind of gross, imaginative, constructed a narrative experience happens at the coarse level. Then at the subtle level, we have this more emotionally charged and maybe intuitive, expressive, like if you want to say poetic, or like a song, like when you get a song stuck in your mind, it's like that kind of more emotionally charged narrative or symbolic expression. And then at the extremely subtle level, we have this sort of pure intuition, which is an intuition which doesn't know things by remembering other things, right? That the basis of constructed perception is that you know one thing by comparing it to another, whether it's an image or a word or whatever. And this one knows things directly by just experiencing them, by like the Vulcan mind meld, right? So emotions then live in the subtle body, and within the map of the subtle body, like circulating around the heart chakra, they're this swirling, what they call instinctive habit patterns. There's 112 of them or something like that, and so and they're understood as coming in 3 different layers, right? So the desirous is on the outer layer, so all the wanting to connect, desiring another person, desiring food, desiring whatever, then there's the aversion-oriented ones, fearing, anger, violence, and then there's the delusion-oriented ones, which have to do with withdrawing, like depression or sort of involution, self-centeredness, and all of doubt, and all of these things. So those are seen as sort of like, like a kind of almost like an obstacle course that you need to get through to get to the central channel, to be able to what they call unravel the heart knot, or unravel the knots that block access to the extremely subtle mind. And so, let's just say we can compare these to the modern notion of the brain, right? That we have the triune brain, right? Like, even it's an old model, but it's a good model. The primate brain, which thinks and imagines, the limbic brain, which emotes and has this sort of emotional reactivity, and the reptilian brain, or the vertebrate brain, which has sort of our basic life support and our basic states of consciousness. And so, you can say that the subtle body, this map, I believe it can be cross-mapped with our brain map. And I don't think this is a vague, airy-fairy thing. I think this is actually exploring the same nervous system from the inside that we've explored from the outside, right? So feeling your way into the nervous system, the feeling science, the intuitive science. So their emotions would be in the subtle body. They're integral to what keeps us from accessing the sort of tide of going from one emotion to the next, and a lot of them being stress emotions. That whole turbulence is what keeps us from being able to still the mind and move toward the sort of more calm and ultimately blissful core network. I call it the core well-being network, right? The network that's basically about feeling safe, connected, right? And we need to sort of steer through those emotions to get to that essence of who we are, where we feel, safe, opening and connecting and being fully present with others.
This was for me a really important distinction, because in my worldview with the teachers that I had, the emotion, the way this is framed, the emotions seem to be more like coming from a reactive state and creating this turbulence, whereas what you call feelings seem to be more like being in this consciousness of perceiving one own pure state before all the confusion and the stress and the reactivity comes in. And
Well, yeah, think of it like this, that we have, in order to survive, we've developed a range of different emotions. Now, a lot of them are blissful and peaceful and loving and caring. We have social emotions and well-being states, and we have stress emotions that are the harsh or reactive or fragmenting emotions. But they're all thrown in together in a kind of soup of unconsciousness. We don't know why we feel we love one person or one thing or why we hate another. It just happens to us. So it's not that, they're both operating at the same level, but what we're trying to do is not kind of, we're not trying to get rid of any of these emotions. What we're trying to do is get rid of the unconsciousness that keeps us from understanding what's at the heart of them. And once we get to the heart of the emotions, then we can have an artful relationship with our emotional life. And we can use all of these emotions artfully and constructively, even if it's a kind of showing anger or showing love or a bliss or awe. They all become art if we can integrate them with this deeper source consciousness or deeper kind of unconditional awareness. So it's really transforming our whole emotional life from the place where we're pushed around by emotions and we're proximate to them, right? Where they cause us to go into the place where we go to the cause of, and we're actually really manifesting them from the inside out in a helpful or beautiful or artful way.
I love that.
Yeah.
I've never heard it that way. Because oftentimes I got the sense that the whole thing of transcendence and going away from suffering always felt to me like, oh, that equates with transcending all emotions and not being feeling anymore anger or what that is. And that sounds very different. I like that. I love that.
It is very different. I mean, and this is the unique thing about the tantric approach to psychology, spirituality is in the tantric method, they view these other earlier systems of training the mind, which are about reaching dispassion or learning how to control your destructive emotions and develop your positive emotions, as preliminary practices. So you start by training. The simplest thing to do with an emotion is try to not act on it and try to not let it push you around. Then you maybe want to be able to shift out of what are maybe harmful to you or others and shift into what's good. But the ultimate art and science is that you go to the next level where it's more like an alchemical approach, where you can turn any emotion into, you can see the benefit of all the emotions and turn them into their medicine, right? Or what? Because once they become aligned with wisdom and awareness, then they become like medicine. They become useful and helpful, right? So it is a very different relationship with emotions, which is about transformation rather than eliminating or repressing or controlling or judging.
I love that also so much because of I think you can look at it in psychology, you can look at it in just regular social experience, or in the spiritual tradition, right? I mean, there's, because of certain emotions being seen as negative, right? There's all that spiritual bypassing stuff, and people make the jokes about how spiritual people are so repressed and very angry, really, even though they don't look like it. And it's kind of funny because it's really this integration and acceptance as this kind of super cool channel to enlightenment, which is one of the things I thought was so awesome about Tantra. And it's very compelling, right? Because socially we repress it and then it blows up all over the place. So I do think, as far as I'm aware, I feel like it blends with certain aspects of psychology, but I And would you say that this is also another aspect of more like the mysticism in the different traditions in general that do?
Yes.
That work with this?
Right. Yeah, like most mystical traditions, including alchemy, are about sublimation. They're about transforming one thing into another. And so, like for example, look at Saint Teresa, and Saint John of the Cross. They're experiencing something that this ecstatic, blissful state, and the inquisitors are thinking they're just having some kind of sexualized, perverse, whatever. But they've turned that love energy. The way they talk about, of course, God and Christ and all the rest is using a lot of this erotic language, as the poetry of the Sufis, Rumi and all of those. All of that actually, in my view, historically was awakened by the tantric movement, which was happening several centuries earlier, and is characterized by all of this sort of ecstatic poetry and the use of the arts. All this, you see how Tibetan Buddhism is all very full of artsy, visuals and rituals and dance and art, and it's all very positive in its relationship with sexuality and even death in a sense. So it actually, one of my one of our faculty, visiting faculty, who I've really enjoyed working with recently, Dr. Nida, is a Tibetan trained doctor and kind of spiritual healer, if you will. And it's hard to say, like a tantric doctor. He's one of the first people I ever found who agrees with me that Freud and psychoanalysis is essentially a tantric discipline. That the understanding, and in Jung you can see it more explicitly, but the understanding that desire is good, that it's necessary, it's not evil, and that our nature is fundamentally good, and that it just requires understanding what has been repressed and learning how to work with it, live with it, transform it, especially in the Jungian context. Jung did talk about, said people have the capacity to transform emotions, that could be destructive, like the death instinct, into love and wisdom and connection and all of that. And that's the basic view of the tantric system, is that there doesn't have to be an unconscious. The unconscious is just an artifact of our being not being so busy surviving. We're not really looking at who and what we are and trying to really understand ourselves and make the most of our nature. But so yeah, I would definitely say that there's a very strong resonance between the general psychotherapeutic approach and the tantras. Of course, the tantras are much more optimistic and have a lot more methodology for working with the unconscious. Right? Like, in other words, we're getting more toward this when we talk about, say, Jungian approaches or Reichian approaches, which are not so mainstream. And nowadays, of course, we have the understanding that we need art therapy and we need embodied therapy or somatic therapy to touch the sort of repressed traumas. But the tantras were way ahead, and they have this very radically optimistic belief that with the right technology, everyone can learn to unravel all of this accumulated stress and trauma, and make the unconscious fully conscious and make an art out of being, human. So it's kind of very naturally, it fits with Western psychology, but it's more like a positive psychology, or transformational psychology, I guess you'd call it.
Maybe now that that you shared the view on this knots around the chakras and the heart, and we defined emotions, I was curious, in your book you write that the knot around the heart is more primal and more complex than the other ones around the throat chakra or the navel chakra. So I was curious, why is that the case? It seems to, again, somehow point towards the heart being
some different than the others. I mean, I wouldn't say better or whatever, but special, or in a way different. There is something different about it.
Right. I mean, the tantric theory about this is that, and I think that this is supported by modern embryology, is that the heart drop, the source of the heart drop is the male and female, is the embryo, like in other words, the fertilized egg, and that the mind and body dissolves, including the neural tube, grows out of the heart space, right? And then and that, so it's kind of the primal source, and that's part of the reason why it's the self-protective instincts are more engaged there, or why it's tighter. I mean, I think a more kind of contemporary neuroscientific way of thinking about it is that in terms of mind mapping of the two maps between the Western map and the tantric map, is that the heart and the lower chakras symbolize the vertebrate brain, the reptilian brain, the brainstem. And so that is where the primal self-protective instincts are located, right? That is, so there's a kind of, that's another kind of Western argument you could make to say, really what they're talking about is just, they're talking about where we feel our primal self-protective instincts, basically the heart is very closely tied in to the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems and the brainstem, where it's regulated from the brainstem, right? The cardiorespiratory centers right there, right next to the sympathetic chain, and right next to the nuclei of the parasympathetic nerves. They're all tangled up in there together, right? So they're really just simply, I think, describing the way in which that what we feel in our heart is like a kind of a little indicator of what's happening in our brainstem, right? So we feel the brainstem in our heart, and that's where we're all knotted up. The other interesting thing is that one of these traditions, the most advanced, the Kala Chakra, which I mentioned, what I call the clockwork system, which has this very radical prophecy for the future of the planet, that we will, through education in contemplative science, all civilizations will be transformed into non-repressive, peaceful, democratic cultures, and every individual will learn how to master their own nature and transform into awakened beings. And so it's a very beautiful, the Shambhala is or Shangri-La, that's the sort of prophecy. But another really interesting and kind of weird thing about it is that they believe in Kala Chakra, unlike all the other systems, the polarity of the side channels switches below the heart. Right. So in other words, up here you have made it the parasympathetic on this side and the sympathetic, or the lunar and the solar on usually the lunar is on the left side and the solar is on the right side. But below the heart it's flipped. Right. And I believe that refers to the fact that the upper body is primarily regulated by a new branch of the vagal nerve, this is related to something called polyvagal theory, but the new branch of the vagal nerve is what allows us to consciously breathe, and also what works to calm the heart, right? It acts as what's called a heart brake, whereas below the diaphragm, below the heart, the older vagal nerve operates, and it's much more hard to control, and it's much more unconscious and primal. So a lot of our anxiety and a lot of our guardedness happens in the lower body. So I think that there's, what they're describing, or they noticed this bifurcated nature of the nervous system, at least the autonomic nervous system, and I think that's somehow what is described by the unraveling, by the heart not being so important, because essentially that's kind of like the guts or the heart of the autonomic nervous system, or the subtle nervous system.
This is really so fascinating.
This is like a speculative tantric neuroscience.
No, but I love that you have the background, as a medical doctor, and deep knowledge of the original, scriptures, because you write them, you can read them, and I think this already gives two very different perspectives on the same topics you read about.
Yeah, and that's really what, in terms of my journey, that's what's been so exciting about this, is that almost allows having the two almost allows you to go beyond either one of them. You know what I mean? To sort of get a window into what the sort of subtlest part, aspects of our being, or reality are. So it's very exciting to be able to kind of use the two together to kind of look a little deeper.